Okay, this feedback is for Joe the Joe. For this comic panel that they've drawn. The question is, I'm trying to do a scene of somebody taking off running with great speed, but I feel like I need to show some sort of trail going along the road to convey that. I tried to do an air current, but it didn't look so great. I thought maybe adding some dome shape to the air would help, but it seems off. If you have any advice how I could best portray that, I super appreciate it. So I asked afterwards, what do you think is not so great about it? Is it the drawing quality? Is it not right for the situation? Like the elements being chosen not right for the situation? Or is it how the solution made the composition looked? And the reply was... And also I asked, have you drawn a character? And the reply was that the character is off-screen, giving off the vibe of they are so fast they are already off the page kind of vibe. So I'm going to give my 2 cents with these in mind. So the choice of having this panel, this idea of somebody dashing off at great speed being conveyed through centering the panel on this explosion, and then the choice of this explosion and other things around it to show the movements. So I'm going to go about it in 3 bullet points to the best of my ability, again, since this is done like just on the spot. So I will first talk about the framing of the shot, how it affects the message being conveyed, so composition. The second thing that I want to talk about would be the nature of the impact, so the type of explosion that that is chosen here to convey the impact of somebody dashing off at like supersonic speed. How this explosion could be drawn, other kinds of explosions that could be used for it, and then the last thing would be focusing on how to actually draw this kind of explosions and stuff to make it fit the composition, whatever it's in. Well, and for example, like perspective would be one thing. So in general, for solving this problem initially, I think it's good to start from a very removed kind of approach, where you're not thinking too much about the details that go into this piece, but rather what you're trying to convey here. Somebody dashing off at super speed, you are choosing to show this by showing the impact that their start of the dash leaves through this explosion, and choosing to have the character already be off screen. But what people see is this panel only, and so you can't tell people what's not on here unless you have a previous panel where the character is on the panel, in which case requiring 2 panels to draw this to convey this message of somebody is running off really fast. That's the message. Requiring 2 panels to draw it, unless you need the pacing, it feels less efficient, kind of unnecessary. And so in this case, I think it's necessary to have a character on here. So I'm just gonna do this. Alright, doesn't really matter. More angle for speed. And in this case, if the character is involved in here, then in order for this composition to be balanced, the explosion would have to yield a lot of the weight horizontally, so that the character has a place to be without being like cropped off the edge. This would be, I think, a better approach to showing, because not only does it show the explosion, it shows who caused the explosion and how, by the angle of their movement. By basically, they know that it's the foot or wherever the opposite momentum to wherever they're going. I think having a character here helps a lot. The problem with what you had originally was that the problem with this was the main message here conveyed by this panel is not somebody is dashing off at great speed. It is there's an explosion caused by an impact, and that's why it's vague. It describes the same scenario, but without context on its own, it's difficult. It doesn't stand strongly on its own to convey what you want to convey. When it comes to stuff like impact, effect, and stuff, the effect comes after the cause, and usually it's a kind of afterthought. It has to be sort of on the side, even if it takes up a lot of space, like a giant mushroom cloud or something. Even if it takes a lot of space, unless it's prepped by a previous panel, having it be center stage and be the focus of your message being conveyed doesn't really help very much. So I'm going to go with this solution for the rest of my points. I believe in this way it becomes a lot easier for you to see where things are coming from and why. So framing wise, I think something like this would be a lot better in showing your message. And then now the next point would be what kind of impact or explosion you would choose to use for this explosion, this impact. Different kinds of like impact clouds, they suggest different kinds of impact. The reason why this impact does not suit this feel very well is because when you're dashing off, you as a person, unless like, okay, the scale of the picture is shown by the window, and so the person is like probably this size. A person this size would very likely, even if the force of their movement is really great, the impact and explosion left by that great force would be concentrated very small here on their heel, their foot, or something. It's not an explosion caused by a shockwave emanating from their entire body. And so the size of this explosion and the scatteredness, it balloons out. So it's like this kind of movement, it comes from a large area, this large area here, this big box area, rather than like from one spot going in the opposite way that they're going. This suggests a different contradicting kind of thing happening to what the character is doing. And then it's also confirmed by like the debris flying everywhere, like going in a much larger selection of directions, kind of again contradicts what you're trying to convey. So I'm gonna talk about the explosion first, like not worry about this ring here. So I have drawn something similar in my comic here. I flipped it so that it's going in the same direction. Let's see. So in here, I basically did this panel here. I show where the cause of this impact is. I lead a trail back to where it originated, and the trail that the explosion that it creates is very precise in direction. It goes this way. If it's precise in direction and it's precise in its origin, goes this way, and then whatever here that's blocked by this pillar like absorbed by the pillar and deflected in different direction, again, precise direction. And also if you notice that because of the force of the impact, instead of using like this kind of soft-ish squiggly lines to show the cloud of smoke, this feels like a contained kind of a contained large-ish but not forceful blast. Instead of doing this, I had very straight lines like this to show that even here, if you give it some time, the debris would probably fly a lot farther, that kind of thing. It shows force of impact and like concentration of impact. And so in this case, in your case, I would probably do the same thing, where instead of these squiggly lines where clouds emanate, I would probably do something like this. So let's say you still draw this big of an impact cloud for the force that he's dashing off. For the force that he's dashing off in. At the same size, I would draw something like this, so straight lines coming from this spot here. Let's say a few more, where you can see that he ran foot, 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 that kind of thing. So big, concentrated explosion. Has direction, has a clear source. The energy has not dissipated enough to like sort of wisp around in the air on its own yet. And it goes directly opposite from the direction that he's going. Then the cause and effects becomes very clear, and the type of explosion caused is much more clearly linked to his size and then the footprint that he leaves behind. So that's the thought in thinking about types of explosion caused. And then the last thing would be the technical execution of this kind of explosion type stuff. In this case, you chose to draw in perspective. So the perspective grid is this. So these are the three axes, X, Y, Z. And you have to abide to these for all elements on this picture. Even the explosion, even though it feels like it's kind of okay, I drew an isometric grid, but even though it looks like it's kind of two-dimensional or like everywhere, this is done pretty well. You can sort of see a hint of perspective, and perspective, because there's sort of like a side block element here. You can sort of see it like this, and so this is very well done in terms of perspective. And then that would apply to something like this as well, even though the spread of the explosion is not as dramatic. But what could be worked on here is this ring here, if you want to have this sort of ring effect. Oops. If you want to sort of have this ring effect, so this ring has to abide also to the perspective. So the center is here, center all along the path is here, right? And then from this center, you draw this second grid based on the lines that you've established on a sidewalk, and the half circle has to be in perspective like this. And what was wrong with here is that when you draw these lines, they don't align with this grid that you have established. Same thing with the little sphere here, air. So if you had done it according to perspective, I think it would look more believable convincing, or like at least it looks like it belongs in the same same perspective, same space. So like this, right? So that they belong together. I personally don't think it's necessary because like I think these kind of things, they come later. It doesn't really happen at the start of a dash, I think. Usually it's when this is like kind of breaking the sonic barrier type effect, and that's usually like sometime into acceleration that it becomes effective. It's also a shape that kind of contradicts, doesn't really work well with this kind of blast. They look better when you draw something like this, where there's like a comet or something. So one long, thin kind of projectile, and then it's better to, or looks better to use these kinds of circles to broaden the width of this projectile that would otherwise look really underwhelming, without making the projectile look gigantic, or having to sort of give it explosions that it doesn't generate. So it's also about the shape combo, like which ones work with which. And in this case, the size of the blast is already quite large, so having more of these here, especially against created by a small object that is in motion, it seems unlikely and a bit over the top and does not convey the message of how he's moving very well. So I think if you did like focus on the nature of the explosion while you work on this panel, thinking about exactly what kind of explosion, what kind of effect is caused by him dashing off, and just focusing on this rather than continuing to add elements and elements like blast and then these circular shapes and then like zoom lines. The more you add to it, the less cohesive it looks, and the harder it would be for you to concisely convey exactly what you're trying to do. So I hope that helps.